Maggie Gyllenhaal, you star in the miniseries The Honorable Woman as Nessa Stein, who is an English businesswoman who gets caught up in Middle East politics. Was that region and conflict something that you were interested in even before taking the role?
Um, yeah, I mean, I was as interested in it as somebody who reads the newspaper, tries to read the newspaper every day as best they can. Um, and so I think it's hard not to be interested in it if you're paying attention to what's going on in the world, but I wasn't an expert at all. And I learned a lot about it through doing the project.
Did making the miniseries have a significant effect, on your outlook on that whole situation? Like, maybe make you see it from a point of view you hadn't before?
Yeah, I mean, making the miniseries changed my outlook on many things, but um, you mean the geopolitics of that part of the world? I mean, I know a lot more about it now than I did when I started. And, I think it was hardest to find information on Palestine. So I learned a lot more about Palestine than I had known before I started. I think I have a I think I have a real compassion for both sides that I thought I had before, but I think it wasn't in my heart before. I didn't know enough about it for it to have really deeply impacted me before. So I thought, in my brain, in my mind, I had compassion, I had understanding, I had criticisms for both sides before I started, but then, I got really informed. And then it was hard to read anything. I mean, when the show premiered in the UK, was right in the middle of the troubles in Gaza, and I was reading the newspaper obsessively. I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and I was finding it. It was an emotional experience as opposed to just an intellectual one, which is what it was before. I thought it was kind of amazing also that, like, in the midst of that, that there was Attica, Lubna's character, who was a Gazan woman, who was someone you could sort of follow every day in the midst of watching what was happening in the world, which I think was something that there wasn't maybe a lot of access to at that time.
You mentioned the events of last summer. Tensions increasing. Last year. Coinciding with this miniseries sort of coming out. Did that make it more complicated to talk about the miniseries, or maybe was it a really good opportunity to really just discuss all of those issues?
Well, it was complicated because, I'm not actually a politician, I'm an actress. And so my intention going into it was to create a character that maybe people on both sides could hear. And I found, I felt, am I equipped to speak to the politics of what's happening here as Maggie? I mean, Nessa certainly is. Nessa had lots of interesting things to say in the beginning, which shifted very much as the piece goes on. But was I equipped to speak to it? And in a way, I sort of felt like the piece spoke so much better than I could about my feelings about the conflict. And that, look, I was a major player in the making of the piece, so what the piece says definitely represents my points of view as much as anyone else's, right? I mean, I think when you're in, so many frames of something, you have a huge impact on what it says also. But of course, it's also Hugo and his brilliant mind and his compassion and his intelligence. And I kind of was shocked by how much people on both sides of the conflict, and I really got to know, I mean, that was one thing I did, was I sort of found people who were very far over and very intelligent, way over on the spectrum of either side of the conflict. And I asked them what I should read. And then I sort of was getting feedback from those people all the way, through the show airing. And I was amazed by how they could hear the show, even though they were very far over on both sides,
There is a lot of anger and passion on both sides of that issue, and there's a lot of destruction and tragedy, but then the miniseries, it shows people who are fighting for positive change, like Nessa and even Hayden Hoyle, who's the MI6 agent played by Stephen Ray in the miniseries. Do you see the Honorable Woman as hopeful about the conflict, or pragmatic, or what do you think about the lasting, the takeaway from the miniseries in that sense?
Well, it never takes the possibility of reconciliation off the table. I think there's a real hopefulness in that, obviously. I think that, and this is like with a 1.5 year retrospect after having finished shooting it. We finished it not this past December, but the December before that. That's when we finished shooting it. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately, because I think in so many ways right now, I feel like the show is about, like, who are you really? Who are you on a personal level? For Nessa, who are you really? For me, even in terms of making it, geopolitically, Israel, Palestine, who are you really? The United States, UK, how are you involved really? And that kind of a question is a difficult question. It always hurts to be totally honest. So I think it's asking us to think about, what the reality of the situation is, as opposed to what we wish it would be. So is that hopeful? I mean, I think ultimately that's the only chance we have of reconciliation, ultimate peace, is to all look at ourselves in the way that we're educated in all of it. Who are we really, and what can we do, and how are we, who are we really?
In addition to the conflict in the Middle East, the story also seems very much focused on the experiences of women in positions of leadership and authority, and in this situation. Do you think gender is a big part of how Nessa is treated by those around her, and how she experiences these conflicts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it was a story about a woman, about well, I'm 37 now, and I was 35, 36 when I made it. So it was a story about a woman who's 36, and how she fits into the world as a political person, as a sexual person, as an intelligent person, as a, totally lost and confused person, as a member of her family, that's what it was following in terms of Nessa. And, I think it is, it is interesting to look at, like, what does it look like to be a woman in a position of power, and how does sex and, style and femininity play into that, as well as intelligence and, like, deep vulnerability and confusion. And I think she's sort of starts out and you think she's one thing, or she's doing this, like, incredible performance of being this powerful woman, and then pretty early on, I'd say by the end of the first episode, she starts to crack up. That performance starts to crack up all of the vulnerability, the real weakness, the like, deep confusion, the baby in her comes out, and then the rest of the piece is kind of about, for Nessa, is about finding a reality of who she actually is. And so, yes, of course, in this case, because this is a story about a woman, that includes all sorts of things that wouldn't be in it. I don't know. I sometimes think about Nessa as, like, it's so hard to pinpoint her. Like, if someone asked me today when I was doing an interview, is she an anti-hero or is she a hero? And I thought, well, I don't know, you know. And I think what's interesting about the piece, and this has so much to do with Hugo's brilliant work in it, is that it doesn't tell you, look, here are all the signs that say this is your hero, so follow her, don't worry, anyone who's against her is a bad guy. It doesn't do that for you at all. So that you know, there'll be moments where you think like, I'm really cannot stand this woman, I can't believe she said that, that's disgusting. And then there'll be other moments where you say, I completely understand her and I totally relate to her and I'm on her side. So then you, because it's constantly shifting, you have to choose, you have to think for yourself. You know, you have to decide what your own ideas are and who you know, what you think is heroic and not heroic. And that's what I'm like kind of always into.
A lot of the material in this miniseries seems like it must have been, physically demanding, especially a lot of the scenes that take place in the Middle East, the flashback scenes, and then later on in the miniseries, she ends up back there in present day. Was it a physically taxing shoot?
Kind of, but it was like really, it was so, everyone was so loving and inspiring artistically. So it's like, usually when you're working, and even if you have to do really hard stuff physically or emotionally, if you're working with other actors who are awesome and a director who's really into it, it gives you back a lot of energy and you actually don't really feel exhausted at the end of the day. You feel excited by what you guys are making together. And I mostly felt like that. I mostly kind of thought, I mostly felt really turned on by it and excited about it. And I have never been in a position where I was like, had any of the action stuff going on. I've never been like filmed running, and blown up in a explosion. And that was kind of new for me. And I dug it. I thought it was like another side of things. Not my favorite. It's not my favorite at all. Like my favorite is the tiny little back and forth interaction between people. But I had never really done that before, so but it didn't make me tired.
One of the you mentioned the smaller back and forth moments between characters, and certainly one of the central relationships for you in the miniseries is with her friend and translator Attica, who you mentioned, who is a Palestinian. A lot of your most emotionally intense scenes are with her, and we find out that they went through this intense ordeal together. What was it like working together as actors to develop that very unique relationship those two women have?
Hmm. It's funny, Lubna, who plays Attica, Lubna and I are very, very different in the way we approach scenes and just as people. And I think in a way, the fantasy I had of what their relationship was going to be, I mean, it was very different than what the reality was. And that's often true. You'll have a kind of fantasy of what you think a relationship is going to be. And then the reality of the real interaction between like me and Lubna absolutely going to have to be included in the relationship between Nessa and Attica. You know what I mean? So that it was very different than I had fantasized or imagined when we actually got on set together. And my thing is always to include that and to make that the reality of the show also. And so I actually think our relationship was much more interesting than I first sort of thought, like they're soulmates, and it's not what they are. I remember there's a scene where I didn't want to give anything away, right? I better not give anything away. There's a scene where we're together and oh God, I can't not, this is one scene that's very difficult to talk about without giving like major plot points away, but she sort of suggests a solution.
Yeah, feel free to talk about your plot points. I will just let people know that, they should go watch The Honorable Woman, pause this, and then, and come back to us.
In The Honorable Woman, there were some you like can't let on. So I'm gonna be careful. She makes a suggestion. She sort of tries to solve something for me, and in like a real moment of desperation. And I don't know, the way in one scene, the way she sort of makes that suggestion, I kind of went, you're like Patti Smith or something. Like she just inside the scene, I was thinking like, you are so fierce. Like what an unbelievable suggestion to have made. And that was the point where I really felt close to Lubna and Attica, you know, and before that I felt like it just took us a while to find where we were actually intimate, which I think is kind of cool because these women are thrown together totally by chance. I mean, they didn't choose each other. So our unusual relationship was actually more interesting, I think, than like the fantasy relationship that I had before. But then there were other ones, like the relationship with Nathaniel Bloom, the bodyguard. I like loved Tobias Menzies. He became a really good friend of mine. He is a very similar actor to me. And that relationship then had a kind of importance in the piece that maybe wouldn't have otherwise if we hadn't really made a connection. Or the same thing with Genevieve, who played Frances, my assistant. You know, she was such a brilliant actress and she didn't have nearly enough to do. And we were together all the time. And all of a sudden, Frances, you know, there's a scene in the back of the car with me and Frances, Nessa and Frances, and she's sort of saying, like, what are you doing? Why aren't you, like, doing everything you can to get that little boy back? You know, that scene? And it's one of my favorite scenes in the whole piece. And, you know, all of a sudden Frances, because Genevieve is so fantastic, is somebody who, you know, she probably speaks 5 languages. She's totally overqualified for the job. You know what I mean? It kind of informs the character. And Hugo's writing is so good that it can hold so many different things inside each of these characters. So, I mean, with Attica, with Lubna, I don't know how to describe that relationship. It was wild. It was like a real human interaction between two people who were very different and loved each other.
Earlier this year, you know, you won the Golden Globe for The Honorable Woman, you know, Best Actress in a movie or limited series, and you talked very memorably in your speech about, not just not just all these roles for women, but having specifically complex and realistic roles for women. Is that part of what drew you to a TV project? You know, after being so much better known usually for film.
Yeah, but it wasn't in an intellectual way like that. It was just something drew me to this project. You know, it was all of it. It was the character, and I hadn't ever read a character where there was the possibility to express so much. You know, the spectrum of what I could do was so huge. You know, and I could see that from reading it. But also, you know, I couldn't put it down when I was reading it, and I remember talking to my manager who sent it to me, and she was like, okay, it's 8 hours. And we had a weekend, and, we sort of like kept checking in with each other. I'm on episode 2. Don't tell me what happens. I have to put my kids to bed, and then I'm going to try to read up to episode 4, and I just couldn't put it down. But I think it was a combination of those things. And I don't know. Also, I think it was like sometimes things just come to you, and they come to you because there's something in it that like you have to deal with. And that was certainly the case on this for me. Like I learned so much about myself playing Nessa. It's easier to learn things pretending you're someone else, It's like when you have to learn things as yourself, there's like a lot at stake. And so it's for myself.
It was interesting. At the Golden Globes, this year you happened to be nominated. Your brother Jake Gyllenhaal was also nominated. For Nightcrawler. What was it like being able to sort of share that experience with him?
It was awesome. It was great. It was I don't know what to say about it. It was really awesome. It was really cool. We went together, and And what can I say? We've actually gotten really close lately. We've always been close enough, but something shifted. I think that happens, with people, friends, siblings. Um, I don't know. I mean, of course, it's just awards, and it's, but it was so lovely to be with him. And in a way, it makes it feel more real, because it was my brother going like, let's celebrate together and let's get dressed up and like, let's have a good time. And, you know what I mean? I went in to have a good time, and I totally did. I had a cold. I had a pretty bad cold, but you forget about that after a while, You're just like, so I loved that.
That was actually your third Golden Globe nomination. The first one you were ever nominated for was back in 2003. It was for the film Secretary, and that was a big breakthrough for you. And you had a lot of some of your first early awards attention for that movie. You were up for everything from the Spirit Awards to the MTV Movie Awards. What was that whole experience like? With that film, going through that whole experience for what must have been really the first time. Like,
with Secretary, well, I loved that movie. I mean, the thing that's been kind of amazing about the Golden Globes is the movies and the television that they've recognized me for have been ones I've really loved, like particularly loved, and also that needed it. Like Secretary needed a little attention, Sherry maybe needed a little attention, Honorable Woman needed a little attention, made a huge difference for those shows. I mean, I didn't know that with Secretary. With Secretary, I was just like on a ride, and I was 25, and nobody had ever given me beautiful dresses, to wear, and I'd never done any of it before. I didn't know, and I didn't know it would ever end. I sort of thought like I didn't have any perspective at all on it, but I loved the movie, and I loved James Spader, and I loved Steve Shainberg, who directed it, and so it was a thrill at that time. I had no sense of how it related to like actual life, but it felt, it was like great to celebrate something I was proud of.
And you've been in film and TV, and you've also done a lot of theater. You just made your Broadway debut late last year, in the play The Real Thing. Is there any particular medium that you gravitate towards more than the others, that, how you work as an actor, you sort of feel most at home in?
I don't know. I'm really into long form television right now. But the way we worked on The Honorable Woman is not the way that you usually do it, so I don't know if the way you usually do it would be as appealing. But in The Honorable Woman, we had all 8 scripts. I had one director for the whole thing, who I came to trust, which is another interesting story. That wasn't easy to begin with, but in a way, it was just like a huge movie. It was like a movie where you didn't have to worry only about telling a story. You could kind of go in like a novelistic way into weird little nooks and crannies of who this person is. And it was just like you had like a bigger canvas to work with. So I really liked that. I would like to do that again. And I also loved the way, like when you work on a movie, and we're all so used to a 90-minute or a 2-hour format where you kind of know the rhythm of it. And as much as you try to get out of that kind of typical rhythm, we're all so used to it. It's like beating in our hearts. It's really hard to shake it. Whereas when you're working in 8 hours, and also we cross-boarded everything, which means we shot sometimes all in one day, the first episode, a piece of the 5th episode, a piece of the 8th episode, so we're basically doing it like a huge movie. You can't hold on to that rhythm. You can't say, oh, I wept and I showed my heart in this scene, so now I can't do it again for the rest of the movie. Or you can't say, oh, I've the protagonist and the antagonist have come together, it's going to probably be over in 15 minutes. You know, it's like you can't hold it like that. So instead, this kind of way more human, unusual thing gets expressed, which I just thought was, I love the way it looks. I love the product of working that way. So I really, really liked that. And that has so much to do with Hugo and the way he works also. It's not just the form. I loved working with Hugo. And but I like that form a lot. And I like doing theater. I'm not so into the huge commercial aspect of doing it on Broadway. To be totally honest, I love my little tiny plays I've done with my husband and the 200-seat theater on 13th Street that, you know, that we've worked at. That sort of feels, I don't know, safe and kind of wilder at the same time.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the Honorable Woman and the Golden Globe win and got the Emmys coming up in a few months. So fingers crossed there as well. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you.